Jake shifted in his chair and leaned forward as Zexthul prepared to describe what sounded like the most critical phase of the entire war. The alien commander's bioluminescent patterns were pulsing more rapidly now, suggesting that he was accessing memories that were particularly significant or disturbing to him. Dr. Harper made adjustments to her recording equipment to ensure that every detail of what was about to be revealed would be captured for future analysis. Commander Morrison asked Zexthul to identify the specific moment when he had realized that the Catherian invasion was not proceeding according to plan and might actually fail completely. The alien leader was quiet for several long moments before responding, and when he spoke, his voice carried what sounded like genuine regret, mixed with professional admiration for his former enemies. Zexthul explained that the turning point had occurred approximately 3 months into the invasion, while he was aboard his flagship reviewing intelligence reports from Catherian forces deployed across Earth. What he had been reading in those reports contradicted everything that his species understood about warfare conquest and the behavior of defeated populations under occupation. The alien commander described the scene in detail, starting with his arrival at the command center of his flagship, where dozens of Catherian officers were processing information from ground forces scattered across every continent. The reports that were coming in painted a picture of an invasion that was not collapsing as expected, but was instead evolving into something that no Catherian strategist had ever encountered, instead of human resistance diminishing over time as their resources were depleted and their leadership was eliminated. The reports indicated that human opposition was actually becoming more organized and more effective with each passing week. Worse yet, the humans were displaying technological capabilities that seemed to violate everything the Catherians thought they knew about Earth's level of scientific development. One report that particularly disturbed Zexthul described events in the Australian continent where human forces had apparently developed a method for detecting Catherian submarine movements, using what appeared to be communication with large marine animals. The report indicated that a human scientist named Carl Jensen had somehow established contact with Earth's whales and was using them as an early warning system for underwater alien operations. This type of interspecies cooperation was completely outside Catherian experience, and their strategic computers had no framework for analyzing or countering such tactics. The idea that humans could coordinate with other Earth life forms to create military advantages was so unexpected that many Catherian commanders initially dismissed the reports as errors or exaggerations. But additional intelligence confirmed that Jensen was indeed working with marine biologists and naval personnel to create an underwater detection network that extended across thousands of miles of ocean. The whales were apparently able to sense Catherian ships through their sonar, and were somehow communicating this information to human operators who could then coordinate attacks on alien submarines. Captain Kelly asked how such communication between humans and whales was possible, and whether the Catherians had encountered similar phenomena on other worlds. Zexthul admitted that no other conquered species had ever demonstrated the ability to establish meaningful contact with non-sentient life forms for military purposes. The closest equivalent in Catherian experience was their own use of genetically modified creatures as weapons, but that involved direct biological control rather than cooperative communication. The alien commander went on to describe other examples of what he called creative desperation that were being reported from human resistance groups around the world. In every case, humans were finding ways to turn their disadvantages into advantages, and were using resources in ways that completely defied logical analysis. One particularly striking example involved the conversion of major sports stadiums into weapons manufacturing facilities. Humans had somehow transformed these entertainment venues into industrial centers that were producing modified equipment for resistance fighters. They were using the stadium lighting systems to power manufacturing tools, and were converting the food service areas into chemical laboratories for creating improvised explosives and other weapons. What made this even more remarkable was that these operations were being staffed largely by volunteers who had no previous experience in manufacturing or weapons production. Humans who had worked in restaurants or retail stores were learning complex technical skills in a matter of days, and were producing equipment that was effective against Catherian technology. Dr. Harper interrupted to ask about the psychological impact that these developments were having on Catherian forces. She wanted to understand how an alien military that had never experienced defeat was handling the stress of fighting an enemy that refused to follow predictable patterns of behavior. Zexthul paused before answering this question, and the patterns on his skin shifted to colors that Dr. Harper had learned indicated emotional distress or uncertainty. The alien commander explained that Catherian society was built on principles of calculated risk and predictable outcomes. Their military forces were trained to operate within parameters that had been established through centuries of successful conquest. The chaotic and unpredictable nature of human resistance was creating psychological pressure on Catherian soldiers who had never been trained to handle situations where their standard procedures were ineffective. Many alien troops were beginning to experience what their medics identified as stress reactions, similar to what humans might call anxiety or fear. This was particularly problematic because Catherian military doctrine assumed that their technological superiority would always provide clear tactical advantages that would minimize casualties and ensure victory. When human resistance proved capable of negating these advantages through innovation and adaptation, Catherian forces found themselves fighting a type of war that their training had never prepared them for. The turning point that Zexthul considered most significant occurred when human forces managed to capture an intact Catherian command ship during a battle near the ruins of Phoenix. The operation had been led by a human military officer named Janet Martinez, who had coordinated ground and air forces to overwhelm the ship's defenses and force it to land. What happened next was completely unprecedented in Catherian military history. Instead of simply studying the captured alien technology or attempting to use it as leverage in negotiations, humans had immediately begun modifying and improving the ship's systems. Within hours of the capture, Martinez and her technical team were making changes to the vessel that enhanced its performance beyond its original specifications. The alien commander admitted that this was the moment when he personally realized that the Catherian Empire was facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The idea that a conquered species could not only capture advanced alien technology, but could actually improve upon it within such a short time frame, challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between technological development and military capability. Jake asked for more details about the modifications that humans had made to the captured Catherian ship. Zexthul explained that Martinez's team had somehow integrated human and alien systems in ways that created hybrid technologies that were more effective than either species had developed independently. They had combined human creativity with Catherian engineering to produce weapons and defensive systems that exceeded the performance parameters of both civilizations. Even more disturbing from the alien perspective was that humans were sharing these technological innovations across their resistance networks, just as they had shared tactical information. Within days of the Phoenix capture, similar hybrid technologies were appearing in human operations on other continents, suggesting a level of coordination and communication that Catherian intelligence had been unable to detect or disrupt. The alien commander concluded this portion of his account by stating that the capture and modification of the command ship had marked the beginning of the end for Catherian hopes of conquering Earth. From that point forward, human resistance had access to alien technology that they could understand and improve, while Catherian forces found themselves fighting an enemy that was becoming stronger rather than weaker as the war continued. Zexthul paused and looked directly at Jake, before adding that the most troubling aspect of the entire situation had been the gradual realization that humans were not just defending their world, but were actually winning a war against an enemy that possessed superior numbers, technology, and military experience. This outcome had been calculated as impossible by every computer model and strategic analysis that the Catherian Empire possessed. The interrogation room fell silent as Zexthul prepared to explain the final phase of the war and the ultimate reasons for humanity's victory. Jake could sense that they were approaching the most important part of the alien commander's account, and he found himself holding his breath as he waited for the revelations that would finally answer the questions that had haunted him since the invasion ended. Dr. Harper leaned forward in the observation room, while Captain Kelly remained alert but clearly interested in hearing the conclusion of Zexthul's remarkable story. The alien commander seemed to be gathering his thoughts as the bioluminescent patterns on his skin shifted through several different colors before settling into a steady rhythm that suggested deep contemplation. Jake asked the alien leader to explain exactly why the Catherian Empire had ultimately decided to withdraw from Earth, rather than continue fighting until they achieved complete victory. He wanted to understand the strategic calculations that had led to such an unprecedented decision by a military force that had never accepted defeat in over 3 centuries of galactic conquest. Zexthul began his response by explaining that the concept of defeat meant different things to different species, and that this fundamental difference in perspective had been the key factor in humanity's survival. He said that in every previous conquest the Catherian Empire had encountered, there had always come a moment when the defending species recognized that continued resistance was futile and chose to surrender in order to preserve what remained of their civilization and culture. This rational calculation had been based on simple mathematical realities, involving casualty rates, resource depletion, and the inevitable outcome of fighting against superior technology and numbers. Every species that the Catherians had encountered had eventually reached a point where their leadership concluded that surrender was preferable to total extinction, and had agreed to terms that allowed their people to survive as part of the imperial system. The alien commander explained that Catherian strategic doctrine was built around this universal pattern of behavior, and their invasion plans always included provisions for accepting surrender once the defending species reached their breaking point. The timing of this surrender could usually be predicted with considerable accuracy, based on factors such as population size, military capability, and cultural values. But humans had proven to be completely different from every other species in the galaxy because they seemed to lack the ability to recognize when a situation was hopeless. Instead of calculating odds and accepting inevitable defeat, humans appeared to view impossible situations as challenges that required creative solutions, regardless of how desperate the circumstances became. Dr. Harper activated her communication system and asked Zexthul to elaborate on this concept of human inability to accept defeat. She wanted to understand whether he was suggesting that humans were simply too stubborn to surrender, or whether there was something more fundamental about human psychology that made them different from other species. The alien commander considered this question carefully before responding that human behavior during the invasion had suggested that their definition of defeat was fundamentally different from that of other civilizations. Most species understood defeat to mean the point at which continued resistance would result in greater losses than acceptance of conquest. Humans seem to define defeat as the complete elimination of their ability to fight regardless of the cost or probability of success. This difference had profound implications for the conduct of the war, because it meant that Catherian forces could never reach a point where they could be confident that human resistance would end. Even when major population centers were controlled and government structures were destroyed, humans continued to organize new forms of resistance that emerged from civilian populations and individual initiative. Zexthul described the final months of the war, when Catherian forces controlled most of Earth's major cities and military installations, but found themselves fighting an endless series of small unit actions and guerrilla operations that showed no signs of diminishing over time. Every strategic victory was temporary, because humans would simply adapt their tactics and continue fighting from new positions with different methods. The cost of maintaining occupation forces became increasingly difficult to justify as human. Resistance consumed resources and personnel that were needed for other imperial operations. More importantly, the unpredictable nature of human tactics was causing casualties among Catherian forces at rates that exceeded what their military leadership considered acceptable for a routine conquest operation. Captain Kelly asked whether the Catherians had considered using more extreme measures to force human surrender, such as the complete destruction of major population centers or the elimination of Earth's ability to support life. Zexthul admitted that such options had been discussed at the highest levels of Imperial command, but had been rejected for both practical and philosophical reasons. The practical issue was that total destruction of Earth would eliminate the strategic value that had made the planet worth conquering in the first place. The Catherian Empire needed Earth's location as a base for further expansion and its resources to support Imperial operations. Turning the planet into a lifeless wasteland would serve no useful purpose, even if it eliminated human resistance. The philosophical issue was more complex and related to Catherian codes regarding the preservation of unique species and cultures. While the Empire had no problem with conquest and occupation, They had policies that prohibited the complete extinction of entire civilizations unless those civilizations posed an existential threat to imperial survival. Humans had never been classified as such a threat because their technology and military capabilities were not advanced enough to seriously challenge Cytherian dominance in the galaxy. This meant that eliminating humanity would violate imperial law and would set precedents that could destabilize the entire conquest system that the Empire had developed over centuries. Jake pressed for more details about the final decision to withdraw from Earth. He wanted to understand the specific factors that had convinced the Cytherian High Council that continued occupation was not worth the cost and effort required to maintain it. Zexthul explained that the decision had ultimately come down to a simple cost-benefit analysis that took into account not just the immediate military situation, but also the long-term implications of fighting a war against an enemy that could not be defeated through conventional means. The High Council had concluded that completely subjugating humanity would require a level of commitment that exceeded the strategic value of Earth itself. The alien commander revealed that intelligence analysts had calculated that total pacification of the human population would require permanent occupation forces numbering in the millions, along with continuous suppression operations that would tie up military resources for decades or possibly centuries. The cost of such an extended commitment would drain imperial strength and would leave the Cytherians vulnerable to challenges from other potential enemies. More disturbing was the realization that human resistance was actually becoming more sophisticated and effective over time, rather than weakening as their resources were depleted. The longer the occupation continued, the more likely it became that humans would develop technologies and tactics that could threaten Cytherian forces in other parts of the galaxy. Dr. Harper asked whether Zexthul believed that humans posed a future threat to the Cytherian Empire. Given their demonstrated ability to resist conquest and their apparent talent for technological innovation, the alien commander was quiet for a long time before answering, and his bioluminescent patterns shifted through several complex sequences that suggested he was struggling with the implications of his own analysis. Finally, Zexthul responded that the Cytherian High Council had reached a conclusion that was unprecedented in Imperial history. They had determined that humans represented something that the Empire had never encountered before in their centuries of galactic expansion. Humans were not just another species to be conquered or avoided, but were potentially equals who might challenge the fundamental assumptions on which Cytherian civilization was based. The alien commander explained that this realization was perhaps more terrifying to Imperial leadership than military defeat, because it suggested that their model of galactic conquest might not be sustainable in the long term. If humans could resist Cytherian technology and tactics, then other species might also possess hidden capabilities that had not been properly evaluated. Jake asked for Zexthul's personal assessment of what would happen if the Cytherian Empire attempted to invade Earth again in the future. The alien leader responded that such an invasion would be extremely unlikely, because the Empire had learned that humans could not be conquered using their traditional methods, and developing new approaches would require resources and time that could be better spent on other objectives. More importantly, Zexthul admitted that the Cytherian military had concluded that any future conflict with humanity would probably result in human victory, regardless of the initial advantages that alien forces might possess. The alien commander continued his account of the invasion, with what seemed like genuine bewilderment in his voice. Jake could see that even now, months after the war had ended, Zexthul was still struggling to understand exactly what had gone wrong with their carefully planned conquest of Earth. The patterns on his skin shifted constantly as he searched his memories for specific examples of human behavior that had defied Cytherian expectations. Zexthul began describing the first day of ground operations in detail, starting with the assault on Chicago. Cytherian forces had landed in the downtown area and had quickly secured what their intelligence indicated were key strategic locations, including government buildings, transportation hubs, and communication centers. The initial resistance from local police and military units had been quickly overcome using standard suppression tactics, but within hours of establishing their perimeter, something unusual had begun happening that their field commanders had never encountered before. Groups of human civilians were approaching the Cytherian positions not to surrender or negotiate, but to launch coordinated attacks using improvised weapons and tactics that seemed to come from nowhere. The alien commander specifically mentioned a human named Tony Rodriguez, who had been identified as a fire department captain before the invasion. Instead of fleeing the city like most civilian officials, Rodriguez had somehow organized other firefighters and emergency workers into an effective combat unit. They were using their knowledge of the city's underground tunnel systems and their specialized equipment to conduct guerrilla operations against Catherian patrols. What made this particularly disturbing from the alien perspective was that Rodriguez and his team were not trained military personnel, yet they were demonstrating tactical creativity that exceeded what Catherian strategists had expected from regular human soldiers. They had modified their firefighting equipment to deliver concentrated chemical attacks against Catherian forces and had turned their rescue vehicles into mobile weapons platforms. Dr. Harper interrupted to ask for more details about these civilian resistance groups. She wanted to understand how ordinary humans with no military training had been able to organize themselves so quickly and effectively against an advanced alien invasion force. Zexthul explained that this was exactly the question that had puzzled Catherian field commanders from the very beginning. According to their pre-invasion analysis, human civilian populations were expected to behave predictably under the stress of occupation. Most individuals would focus on personal survival and would avoid actions that might bring retaliation against themselves or their families. Those who did attempt resistance would do so in disorganized ways that could be easily suppressed by superior technology and firepower. Instead, the Catherians found themselves facing what appeared to be an entirely different species than the one their scouts had been observing for 50 years. Humans were displaying levels of cooperation and innovation that seemed to emerge spontaneously without any central coordination or traditional military structure. Zexthul described another example from rural Montana, where a rancher named Sam Mitchell had organized local farmers into a resistance network that was causing significant problems for Catherian supply operations. Mitchell had no apparent military background, yet he had somehow developed tactics that were disrupting alien logistics across hundreds of square miles of territory. The farmers were using their agricultural equipment in ways that the machines had never been designed for, turning tractors into mobile artillery platforms and converting irrigation systems into defensive barriers. More importantly, they had managed to salvage and reverse engineer pieces of Catherian technology that had been damaged in the initial attacks. Captain Kelly asked how civilian humans had been able to understand and modify alien technology so quickly. Zexthul admitted that this was one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire invasion from the Catherian perspective. Their technology was based on scientific principles that should have been completely foreign to human understanding, yet somehow humans were finding ways to make it work. The alien commander explained that Catherian equipment was designed with multiple security systems to prevent exactly this kind of reverse engineering. Their weapons and vehicles included safeguards that were supposed to make them unusable by any species that did not possess the proper biological markers and technical knowledge. These systems had never failed during previous conquests, but human engineers and scientists were approaching Catherian technology in ways that completely bypassed the intended security measures. Instead of trying to understand the underlying principles, they were simply experimenting with different combinations until they found something that worked. This trial-and-error approach was crude by Catherian standards, but it was producing results that their security designers had never anticipated. Jake pressed for more information about human military responses during this period. He wanted to know how regular armed forces had adapted to fighting an enemy with superior technology and numerical advantages. Zexthul described several encounters with human military units that had completely abandoned conventional tactics in favor of approaches that seemed to defy logical analysis. One example involved a human naval commander named Kate Sullivan who had been in charge of defending the port city of San Diego. When Catherian ships had appeared offshore, Sullivan had not attempted to engage them with her available weapons, which would have been ineffective against alien shields. Instead, she had ordered all human vessels to scatter and hide among the civilian shipping traffic in the harbor. For 3 days, the Catherian naval forces had searched for Sullivan's ships while taking fire from what appeared to be random locations throughout the port area. The alien commanders had been confident that they were facing a few desperate holdouts who would soon run out of ammunition and be forced to surrender. But Sullivan had actually coordinated with local dock workers and fishing boat crews to create a mobile defense network that could strike quickly and then blend back into the civilian maritime traffic. Her forces were using everything from modified pleasure boats to converted cargo ships as weapons platforms, while the Catherians struggled to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. The most frustrating aspect for the alien forces was that every time they destroyed what they thought was a military target, they would discover that it had been a decoy, or that the real threat was coming from somewhere else entirely. Sullivan had somehow turned the entire harbor into a single integrated weapon system that operated according to principles that Catherian tactical computers could not analyze or predict. Zexthul went on to describe similar situations that were occurring simultaneously across multiple continents. In every case, human defenders were displaying what he called chaos adaptability, which seemed to be the ability to turn any situation into an opportunity for creative resistance regardless of how hopeless the circumstances appeared. The alien commander mentioned a particularly disturbing incident that had occurred in the ruins of Detroit, where a group of human civilians led by someone identified as Amy Roberts had managed to interfere with Catherian communication systems, using equipment that should not have been capable of such operations. Roberts was apparently an automotive engineer with no background in electronics or communications technology, yet she had somehow figured out how to disrupt alien transmissions using modified radio equipment. What made this even more alarming was that Roberts was sharing her discoveries with other human groups through improvised networks that the Catherians could not monitor or control. Information about alien weaknesses and tactical innovations was spreading faster than Catherian forces could respond to it. Every successful human attack was being analyzed and improved upon by other resistance groups who had never been in direct contact with the original innovators. Dr. Harper asked whether the Catherians had attempted to adapt their own tactics in response to these unexpected human behaviors. Zexthul admitted that their military doctrine was based on proven methods that had worked against every other species they had encountered. The idea of making significant changes to their fundamental approach had been almost unthinkable to commanders who had spent centuries perfecting their techniques. By the end of the first month of the invasion, Catherian casualties were exceeding acceptable levels while human resistance was actually increasing rather than diminishing. The alien commander concluded this portion of his account by stating that it had become clear that the Catherian Empire was fighting an enemy that operated according to rules that no one in their military hierarchy understood or had ever encountered before. The cold white lights buzzed overhead in the military facility deep beneath the Colorado mountains. Commander Jake Morrison walked down the long hallway past armed guards and security cameras that tracked his every step. His boots echoed against the concrete floor as he made his way to the most secure room in the entire complex. 3 months had passed since the war ended, and today would be different from all the other days since then. Dr. Lisa Harper was already waiting in the observation room when Jake arrived. She looked up from her equipment and nodded at him through the thick glass window that separated them from the interrogation chamber beyond. Her fingers moved quickly across the recording devices and monitoring systems that would capture every word and movement of what was about to happen. Captain Ryan Kelly stood near the door with his hand resting on his sidearm. His eyes never left the massive figure that sat chained to the metal chair in the center of the room. The creature was unlike anything most humans had ever seen before the war began. It stood nearly 8 feet tall even while sitting down and had 4 powerful arms that ended in clawed hands. Its skin was a dark green color with strange glowing patterns that pulsed with a faint blue light across its reptilian features. This was Zexthul, who had once been the supreme fleet commander of the entire Catherian Empire. He had led the invasion, force that brought death and destruction to Earth just a few months ago. His ships had darkened the skies above every major city on the planet, and his weapons had turned entire neighborhoods into smoking ruins. Millions of people had died in the first week alone when his forces struck without warning. But now the roles were reversed, and Zexthul sat as a prisoner in chains, while humans controlled his fate. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. The creature who had expected to conquer Earth in a matter of days was now completely at the mercy of the species he had tried to destroy. Jake opened the heavy door and walked into the interrogation chamber. The alien's large yellow eyes followed his movement as he pulled out a chair and sat down across from his former enemy. The silence stretched between them for several long moments before Jake finally spoke. The negotiations had taken weeks to arrange. Zexthul had initially refused to speak to any human representatives about the war or the reasons for his defeat. He had demanded to be treated as a military prisoner with full honors, according to what he called the universal codes of warfare. When humans explained that Earth was not part of any universal organization and had never agreed to such codes, Zexthul had fallen silent for days. It was Dr. Harper who finally found a way to convince the alien commander to cooperate. She had discovered that the Catherians held their prisoners in conditions that were far worse than what Earth was providing. When this information was shared with Zexthul, along with an offer to improve the treatment of all Catherian prisoners in exchange for his cooperation, he had agreed to the interview sessions. Jake leaned back in his chair and studied the alien's face. The glowing patterns on Zexthul's skin seemed to pulse faster when he was thinking deeply about something. Right now, those patterns were moving in slow, steady rhythms that suggested he was calm but alert. The commander had many questions that needed answers. Military intelligence wanted to know about Catherian technology and their methods of space travel. Scientists were eager to understand how their weapons worked and what other threats might exist beyond Earth's solar system. Politicians needed information about the alien empire's structure and whether they might attempt another invasion in the future. But Jake had more personal reasons for being in this room. He had lost friends and family members during the invasion. He had seen human cities burning and had watched children running in terror from alien aircraft that swept down from the sky like mechanical vultures. He wanted to understand how this had all happened and why the Catherians had chosen to attack Earth in the first place. Zexthul spoke first, and his voice was deep and rough, like gravel being poured into a metal container. The translator device that Dr. Harper had developed allowed humans to understand the alien language, even though it sounded nothing like any human speech patterns. When Zexthul spoke, the device converted his words into English with only a slight delay. The alien commander said that he was willing to answer questions about the war and the invasion, but only if humans were prepared to hear truths that might be difficult to accept. He explained that his species had been studying Earth for many years before the attack began, and they had calculated the probability of human resistance very carefully. According to Zexthul, the Catherian Empire had conquered 47 other worlds using the same basic strategy they had planned to use against Earth. Their scientists had studied human military capabilities and technological development for decades. They had observed human wars and conflicts throughout history, and had analyzed the ways that human governments and societies functioned under stress. All of this information had been fed into massive computer systems that calculated probabilities and predicted outcomes. The computers had determined that humans would be defeated quickly and efficiently, just like all the other species the Catherians had encountered. The probability of total human defeat had been calculated at 97.8%. Jake felt his hands tighten into fists as he listened to these cold calculations about human extinction. The idea that an alien species had studied his people like laboratory specimens and planned their destruction with mathematical precision filled him with anger that he struggled to control. Zexthul seemed to notice Jake's reaction, and the glowing patterns on his skin shifted to a slightly different color. He continued speaking and explained that the Catherian invasion had been planned as a routine operation that would add Earth's resources to their growing empire. They had not expected significant resistance and had allocated only a small portion of their total military forces to the Earth campaign. But something had gone wrong with their careful calculations, and their computer predictions had proven to be completely incorrect. Instead of surrendering after the first devastating attacks, humans had done something that no other species had ever done before. They had fought back with a determination and creativity that the Catherian military had never encountered in all their years of conquest. The alien commander leaned forward slightly, and his yellow eyes seemed to glow brighter as he delivered his final statement. He said that humans should have been extinct within days of the invasion beginning. By every measure that the Catherian Empire used to evaluate potential enemies, Earth should have fallen quickly and completely. Yet here Jake sat as the representative of a victorious species while Zexthul remained a prisoner of the very people he had tried to destroy. The admission hung in the air between them like a challenge that demanded explanation. Jake realized that this was just the beginning of what would be a long and difficult conversation about the nature of human survival and the reasons why Earth had managed to achieve what 47 other worlds had not. Jake pushed his chair back slightly and crossed his arms as he prepared to hear more of what Zexthul had to say about the invasion planning. Dr. Harper adjusted her recording equipment in the observation room, while Captain Kelly remained alert, near the door. The alien commander seemed more willing to talk now that he had begun sharing his perspective on the war. Zexthul explained that the Catherian Empire had developed their conquest methods over 3 centuries of steady expansion across the galaxy. Their approach had been refined through dozens of successful campaigns against other species and had never failed to produce the desired results. The process always followed the same basic pattern that started with careful observation and study of the target world. The first phase involved sending small scout ships that could remain hidden while they gathered information about the planet and its inhabitants. These scouts would spend years studying everything from military capabilities to social structures to technological advancement levels. They would observe how the local species fought their wars and how their governments functioned under pressure. Once the intelligence gathering was complete, the information would be analyzed by powerful computer systems that could predict with remarkable accuracy how any given species would respond to invasion. These computers had been programmed with data from hundreds of previous conquests and could identify patterns of behavior that were common among different types of civilizations. The second phase was the actual invasion, which always began with overwhelming force applied at precisely calculated points. Catherian ships would appear simultaneously above major population centers and military installations. Their weapons would destroy key targets, while their communication systems broadcast surrender demands in the local language. Most species would capitulate within hours once they realized the futility of resistance. The final phase involved the systematic integration of the conquered world into the Catherian Empire. Local governments would be replaced with Catherian administrators, while the surviving population would be relocated to serve the Empire's needs. Some individuals might be selected for special roles based on their skills or knowledge, but most would become basic workers in the Imperial system. This process had worked perfectly on 47 different worlds, spanning dozens of star systems. Each conquest had followed the same predictable pattern, and each had resulted in complete Catherian victory with minimal losses to their own forces. There had never been a significant deviation from the expected outcomes until they encountered Earth. Dr. Harper activated her communication system and asked Zexthul to explain more about the intelligence gathering phase that had preceded the Earth invasion. She wanted to know exactly what the Catherians had observed during their years of studying human civilization and how they had interpreted that information. The alien commander shifted in his restraints, and the glowing patterns on his skin changed to indicate he was accessing deep memories. He explained that Catherian scouts had been observing Earth for 50 human years before the invasion was authorized. They had watched human conflicts from the Second World War through various regional disputes and had studied the development of nuclear weapons and space technology. What the scouts had seen convinced them that humans were a typical developing species with predictable weaknesses that could be exploited. They observed that human nations frequently fought among themselves over resources and territory. They noted that human military forces relied heavily on centralized command structures that could be disrupted by targeting key leadership figures. The Catherian analysts had been particularly interested in studying human responses to overwhelming force. They had observed how human armies behaved when facing superior numbers or technology, and had noted that surrender typically occurred when casualties reached certain threshold levels. They had documented the ways that human governments negotiated with stronger opponents, and had identified the psychological pressure points that could be used to force capitulation. All of this data had been fed into their strategic computers, along with detailed information about human military capabilities as of the invasion date. The computers had calculated that Earth's nuclear weapons posed no significant threat to Catherian ships, which were protected by energy shields that could deflect such primitive attacks. Human space-based defenses were considered negligible, and ground forces were evaluated as being poorly equipped to resist advanced alien technology. Captain Kelly interrupted to ask why the Catherians had chosen to invade Earth specifically rather than simply avoiding human space altogether. Zexthul explained that Earth's location made it strategically valuable as a gateway to 3 other star systems that contained resources the Empire needed. The planet itself was not particularly rich in rare materials, but its position would allow Catherian forces to establish a forward base for further expansion. The alien commander also revealed that humans had been classified as neither a significant threat nor a valuable ally, which placed them in the category of species that should be absorbed into the Empire, rather than negotiated with or eliminated entirely. This classification was based on standard Catherian protocols that divided all encountered civilizations into one of 5 categories, ranging from potential partners to existential threats. Humans had been placed in the middle category, which meant they would be conquered but not exterminated. Their technology was advanced enough to be potentially useful, but not so advanced as to pose a danger to Catherian interests. Their social structures were complex enough to provide effective workers, but not unified enough to mount coordinated resistance. The invasion plan that emerged from this analysis called for simultaneous strikes on 12 major human cities along with targeted attacks on military command centers and government facilities. The Catherian strategists calculated that destroying these key nodes would cause human civilization to collapse within 72 hours. Local military forces would be leaderless and unable to coordinate effective resistance, while civilian populations would flee in panic. Zexthul paused in his explanation, and the patterns on his skin darkened to what Dr. Harper had learned indicated deep contemplation or regret. He said that the invasion had indeed begun exactly as planned, with Catherian ships appearing over major cities, and their weapons striking designated targets with precision that matched their computer predictions. The first day had proceeded according to their timeline, with human military installations suffering devastating damage and government centers being destroyed or abandoned. Communication networks had been disrupted, and transportation systems had been targeted to prevent the movement of human forces. By the end of the first day, the Catherian command staff had been confident that victory was assured. But then something unprecedented had occurred that was not accounted for in any of their computer models or strategic planning. Instead of surrendering or fleeing in disorganized panic, human civilians had begun fighting back with weapons and tactics that defied every prediction the Catherians had made about their behavior patterns. Jake leaned forward with interest as Zexthul described the first signs that their invasion was not proceeding as expected. The alien commander explained that Catherian ground forces had been trained to expect certain standard responses from conquered populations, including fear paralysis, organized evacuation attempts, and eventual submission to superior force. What they encountered instead were humans who seemed to view the invasion not as an inevitable defeat, but as a challenge that required creative solutions. Civilians were modifying construction equipment into weapons and using their knowledge of local terrain to conduct ambush attacks on Catherian patrols. Children were being used as intelligence gatherers, while elderly humans were organizing supply networks for resistance fighters. The most disturbing development from the Catherian perspective was that human military forces were abandoning their traditional doctrine and embracing tactics that seemed to have no logical basis. Instead of attempting to defend fixed positions, they were scattering into small units that could strike quickly and then disappear into urban environments that they knew far better than their alien invaders. Zexthul admitted that within the first week of the invasion, Catherian casualties were already exceeding the computer predictions by a significant margin. More importantly, the expected collapse of human resistance was not occurring despite the destruction of major command centers and the disruption of government communications. The alien commander concluded this part of his explanation by stating that it had become clear to him personally that the Catherian Empire had fundamentally misunderstood something essential about human nature, and that this misunderstanding would ultimately determine the outcome of the entire war.